My name is Bill Keel, and I want to thank Mosaic Church of the Nazarene for letting me share the story about how God interceded in the lives of my wife, Alesha, and I, and prepared us for one of the most trying times we would ever face. I met my wife in 1990 when we were both 20 years old. We dated for 9 years before we got married in 1999. I was baptized in the Lutheran Church as a baby and confirmed when I was in 8th grade. When I met Alesha, I asked her if she had ever been baptized. She told me no. I asked her throughout our time together if she would get baptized, and her answer was always in the typical redhead fashion, "I'll do it when I'm ready, and you're not going to push me into it." She would attend church with me whenever I went, and when our daughter Elizabeth was born in 2002, we made sure that she was baptized right away. In 2017, we took our 15-year-old daughter to Tennessee to see the total solar eclipse. We figured it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We left a few days early to do some other sightseeing. We were traveling through the Smoky Mountains, and we found a place called Clingman's Dome. It is the highest point in the Smoky Mountains, and they say that watching a sunset from the observation tower is something that everyone needs to experience once in their lifetime. The trek up to Clingman's Dome is not for the faint of heart. It's a half-mile walk up a 13% grade. My wife and I were not in the best of shape, and the climb got the better of Alesha, and she had to stop. She told Elizabeth and I to continue, and so we didn't miss the sunset. And she would catch up with us if she could to see it. She told me later that God spoke to her while she was sitting next to the path resting. He told her that something is coming. You need to make your life right. After she rested, she met us at the top, and we watched the sunset together as a family. When we got back from our trip, Alesha started working out and eating healthier. In June of 2018, Pastor Mark Presno, a newly ordained Lutheran minister who had just completed seminary school, accepted a call that our church had put out to replace our retiring pastor. Alesha and I had strayed from the church for a few years, but we decided to come back into the fold with our new pastor. During a meeting with him, I told him that Alesha had never been baptized. I explained to him that I had been trying to get her baptized for the last 25 plus years, and that maybe in a couple of years, when she got comfortable with him, he could probably talk her into doing it. But it was going to have to be her decision. A couple of months later, in September of 2018, Alesha leaned over to me after church and told me that she wanted to talk to the pastor after everyone left. She had been going through some paperwork the day before and came across our daughter's baptism certificate. The anniversary of our daughter's baptism was the next Saturday, and she took it as a sign that it was time to be baptized. Our new pastor was ecstatic. He met with Alesha a couple of mornings that week to give her instructions on adult baptism. He baptized her as one of God's children that Saturday in a private ceremony. She was his first baptism since becoming a minister. Soon after her baptism, Alesha and Elizabeth started confirmation classes together. On January 13th, 2019, Alesha and Elizabeth were confirmed together. 2 days later, on the morning of January 15th, our faith would be challenged. After Elizabeth had gotten on the bus for school, Alesha started complaining about a sudden onset headache. It was like nothing she ever had before. She said the pain was unbearable and it hurt to open her eyes. She asked me to rush her to the ER. When we got there, they put her into a room and tried to give her something for the pain. But nothing helped. She started to violently vomit and finally wore herself out enough that she passed out. Her mom, who's a retired nurse, came up to the hospital, leaving her husband in the care of his son. Alesha's stepfather was suffering from kidney failure and was weeks away from dying. When Alesha's mom arrived at the hospital, they were taking Alesha in for a CAT scan. We sat in the room waiting, saying silent prayers to God to help Alesha. They brought her back into the room, and she was still unconscious and had a towel wrapped tightly around her head to keep the light away from her eyes. Pastor Mark was in the area visiting one of our shut-in members when he heard about us being in the ER. He came up to the hospital, said a prayer over Alesha for healing, a prayer for her mom and I for continued strength. He also said a prayer for the hospital staff that Jesus would guide them to find out what was causing my wife so much pain. A little while after the pastor left, the doctor came in and told us they had discovered an abscess in the middle of Alesha's brain. They knew it wasn't a tumor because it was too new and not very well developed. He told us they were going to send her upstairs to a private room to keep her overnight for observation and wait for an MRI. They were hopeful they could treat it the next day with medication after they got the MRI results. Around 6 p.m. that evening, after a long discussion with Alesha's mom, I decided to run home and get our daughter and bring her up to the hospital. She explained to me that Elizabeth should be able to see her Alesha just in case something happened overnight. I had not told Elizabeth the extent of her mother's illness, as I didn't want her to worry. We arrived at the hospital to find Alesha's mom and our sister-in-law in an empty room. They had taken Alesha up to get an MRI, and we had just missed her. About an hour later, they brought her back, but she was totally unresponsive to any stimulus and in a coma-like state. Elizabeth held her mom's hand and talked to her. Our friend Brad, who stood up for us at our wedding, who was also Elizabeth's godfather, had come up to the hospital to give me support. He offered to take Elizabeth back home and drop her off so my parents could spend the night with her. Alesha's mom and sister-in-law left also. I sat there alone, holding my wife's hand and praying that she would be okay. The neurologist came rushing into the room about 20 minutes later and said that I needed to leave the room immediately. They needed to start sterilizing it. They had found a brain aneurysm during the MRI and needed to start brain surgery right there and then. They could not wait for an operating room to open. I had papers shoved in front of me that I had to sign, giving them permission to shave part of her head, drill a hole into her skull, and then place a shunt 5 inches into her brain. Everything was a blur. I must have signed the papers because I was taken to the waiting room down the hall. Alesha's mom raced back to the hospital. I called my dad so he would know what was going on. The neurologist explained to me that the neurosurgeon couldn't make it to the hospital because of the ice storm that was going on outside. The neurosurgeon's assistant was going to do the first part of the surgery while they used an iPad to FaceTime him in to observe. They started calling out codes over the entire hospital intercom for different specialists to get her room stat. Moments later, we could hear the buzzing of the razor and the drill noises coming from her room. Alesha's mom dropped to her knees and started praying. I started to question God. Why was this happening to us? And pleading for him to save my wife's life. I didn't know how our daughter and I were going to make it through life without her. After what seemed like an eternity, the specialist who assisted the PA came in and told us they had relieved the pressure on her brain, but she was not out of the woods yet. They now had to take her down to the cath lab, insert a camera into her brain through her groin to see where the blood was coming from, and try and repair it, if possible. There was still a great possibility that I was going to lose my 48-year-old wife, and my daughter was going to lose her mother. As they pushed Alesha down the hall past us, I noticed that Alesha had her eyes open, but was not cognizant of us. We followed a nurse to another waiting room downstairs. Our pastor texted me and said he had gotten a call from my dad telling him what happened, and he was on his way. He got there just before 10 p.m., and a couple more of our friends showed up to support me. We sat around telling stories about Alesha, how we first met, our first date, how we went bungee jumping the day before we got married. Pastor comforted me by reminding me that if something did happen, I would see her again in heaven. She was a child of God who was baptized 4 months before and confirmed 2 days before this happened. Many prayers were said while we waited there for 3 hours. About 12:30, the neurologist came in to the waiting room and told us they couldn't find the source of the blood. They would be transferring her up to the neuro ICU unit. They would have to perform the scope procedure again in 7 days. I started to introduce the doctor to everyone. When I got to Pastor Mark, the doctor asked him if he would mind saying a prayer for sometime for his mother. She was in the hospital in Detroit and wasn't doing very well. Pastor Mark said, "Let's pray for Alesha and your mom right now." The 8 of us held hands, and Pastor said a prayer of thanksgiving for Jesus guiding the doctor and nurse's hands. He also asked that if it was his will, to heal the doctor's mother and Alesha. About 15 minutes later, the nurse came in and asked us to follow her. They were taking Alesha out of the operating room and up to the ICU unit. It was very scary to see her for the first time, and I was in shock. Pastor asked the surgical staff to pause a moment, and he put his hands on Alesha and said a prayer of thanksgiving for God watching over Alesha and the hospital staff, and prayed for her continued recovery. They took us up to the ICU unit. There were many tubes coming out of my wife, but the one that was the most shocking was the one coming out of the top of her head. It was attached to a bag that was slowly draining the excess blood from around her brain. Alesha was awake, but looked at everybody like she was seeing them for the first time. Everyone had a chance to say goodbye to Alesha, and then they left. One of the nurses came in and explained to me what they had done during the surgery and informed me that she was never under any anesthesia for any of the procedures. Another nurse came in and told me that she needed to ask Alesha some questions. The nurse started out, "How does your head feel?" Alesha said, "I have a headache." "How long have you had the headache?" "About 4 months." Do you know what month it is?" "It's July." "Do you know where you are?" "I'm in Waterford." "What type of building are you in?" "I'm in a pharmacy." "Why are you in a pharmacy?" "I don't know." "Do you know what year it is?" "It's 2023. The nurse asked the final question. "Alesha, who's the president?" "President Bush." The nurse looked at me and said she had what she needed and told me to talk to Alesha and keep her calm. As I stood there next to the bed, looking at my wife, she glanced over my shoulder and saw a clock on the wall. She asked, "Is it 1 o'clock in the morning or 1 o'clock in the afternoon?" I answered, "It's 1 o'clock in the morning." She said, "Oh, I lost a chunk of time. How long have we been here?" I said, "About 15 hours. She then looked at the clock again and they asked, "Is it 1 o'clock in the morning or 1 o'clock in the afternoon?" I told her once again, "It's 1 o'clock in the morning." She kept repeating the same exact questions over and over again for the next 5 minutes. I moved closer to her and away from the clock, and she asked me, "Where's Elizabeth?" I answered, "At home." "Oh, who's with her?" I told her, "Dad's with her until I can get home." "Oh, where's Elizabeth at?" This continued for a few minutes until a nurse realized that I was about to break down. She interrupted me and told me to head home and get some sleep. She assured me that she would take care of Alesha for me and would call me if anything were to change. It took me 30 minutes to drive the 7 miles home that night on the ice-covered roads. When I got home, I prayed as hard as I could to Jesus for a miracle to happen. I eventually fell asleep sitting on our couch in our living room. Around 5 a.m., our phone rang and my heart sank. I answered it expecting the worst, but it was the high school calling to let me know they had canceled school because of the storm. I started praying again, asking Jesus to wake me up from this nightmare. And if I wasn't dreaming, I asked for guidance on how to explain to our daughter that her mother might not be the same person again. Alesha's father had a brain aneurysm in 1978 when she was 8 years old. He was hospitalized for over 3 months. It took him that long just to learn how to tie his shoes again. He never did learn how to read comprehensively. Worst of all, his personality changed dramatically. Alesha had always said that her daddy went to the hospital, but her father was the one who came home. He would get very paranoid and violent. The best way to describe him was that he did not have a filter. If something would pop into his head, such as chasing 9-year-old Alesha around with a lighter and trying to burn her, he couldn't stop himself from doing it. My mother-in-law and Alesha secretly left him in the middle of the night after 2 years of trying to cope with the changes in fear for their lives. By the time I met him in 1990, he could control himself, but was still not the same person he was in 1978 before the aneurysm. He died in 2009 on our kitchen table from a heart attack. He was a very devoted grandfather and a great father-in-law, and always told me I was the son that he never had. Elizabeth woke up that morning finally around 10 a.m. I made her breakfast and asked if she wanted to go see Mom at the hospital. She, of course, said yes. I loaded her into the car, and we made our way slowly to the McLaren. After a couple of minutes, I looked at Elizabeth and said, "Last night, after Uncle Brad took you home, they discovered an aneurysm in your mom's brain. They did surgery and had to drill a hole in her skull. There's a lot of tubes and monitors hooked up to her. It's going to be scary when you see her for the first time." When I left the hospital last night, Mom was really confused. "Your mom might not be the same person she was yesterday, but we're strong and we'll get through this together." She agreed and sat the rest of the way to the hospital in silence, probably remembering the horror stories she had heard about her grandfather right after his aneurysm. We walked into the ICU unit and down to Alesha's room. I walked in, and to my surprise, my wife was partially sitting up in bed. I looked at her and said, "Hi, hon, how you feeling?" "I've got a little headache, nothing that I couldn't go to work with." Alesha went over and gave her mom a hug and a kiss. I proceeded to ask my wife questions. "Alesha, what month is it?" It's January 16th. What year? 2019. Where are we? She looked at me and said, why are you being stupid? I told her, just answer the question. McLaren Hospital in Flint. Who's the president? She answered, Trump. You know I really don't care for him. I couldn't believe it. Jesus had answered my prayers. Elizabeth jokingly nicknamed her mom Dory from Finding Nemo because of the memory loss the night before. The next day, Alesha started arguing with the doctor because she wanted to get up and walk. The doctor refused. Finally, one of the nurses stepped in and pleaded with the doctor to let her get up, telling him he would take responsibility for her. The doctor finally agreed. The nurse told Alesha that she was going to get some funny looks when he took her out. The nurse had been working there for 15 years and had never seen a patient walking around the ICU unit with an active cranial drain coming out of their skull. Everyone was shocked when she made it around the hall on her first attempt, less than 2 days after brain surgery. Different brain specialists would come in to see Alesha for the first time. Take one look step back out in the hall to recheck the room number, thinking they were in the wrong place. After her brain aneurysm, Alesha became hypersensitive to sound. She still wears earplugs along with over-the-ear hearing protection when attending church, or the music will give her an instant migraine. Crowds will do the same thing. She was in a low-stimulus room, meaning no perfume, no balloons, and no loud noises. One of the other patients, several rooms away, who was not as blessed as Alesha, would moan throughout the day and night, and Alesha said he sounded possessed. Alesha asked me to bring her Bible that she was gifted when she was baptized. Even though she was not supposed to be reading, it brought her comfort to have it next to her when she slept. Her headaches started to get progressively worse about 6 days after surgery, when they started clamping the drain coming out of her skull. They had to get her used to the natural pressure that everyone has in their cranium. If she could not tolerate it, they were going to have to put a permanent drain into her skull, run it down her spine, and into her stomach, just like her dad had. One time, the headache got so bad that the nurses told me to leave so that she could get some rest. I went to our church to pray. The pastor came in. I was halfway through a box of tissues. I asked him, what did I do wrong that my wife was getting worse? What bad thought did I have, or what prayer didn't I say? He told me, that's the devil sitting on your shoulder, whispering those things in your ear. You tell him to go back to hell where he belongs. After a couple hours, I went back to the hospital, and Alesha was sitting in the chair next to the bed, crocheting a baby blanket for one of our friends at the gym. Her headache had eased to a tolerable level. We spent 13 days in the ICU unit and were discharged on a Sunday. Alesha refused to let them push her in the wheelchair out to the car. She told them, I walked into the hospital, I'm walking back out of it. The next day, with her doctor's permission, we were at the gym. Alesha needed to see how her new normal compared to her own old normal. We are very blessed that they are not that different. A couple of days after Alesha was discharged, I took her up to see her stepfather. He broke down in tears when he saw Alesha. He told her that he did not think he was going to get to see her before getting called home by Jesus. He died 5 days later. I asked her neurosurgeon one time to tell me the honest numbers on survival. He told me that what Alesha had was an anterovenous malformation, or AVM, brain rupture. It is much rarer than an aneurysm. 50% of the people who have one die immediately. 50% of the people who survive the initial rupture die within 6 months. Of the survivors, 95% cannot function in society again due to the amount of brain damage they have. Alesha is less than 1% of the people who have a brain AVM. She's a walking miracle. We discovered later that her AVM rupture happened in the exact same area of the brain that her father's did. 3 months after her rupture, she went rock climbing with me and scaled a 60-foot wall on her first attempt. 5 months after her rupture, I was able to help her live her lifelong dream of sculling by surprising her with lessons in Philadelphia. A month later, she joined a sculling club in Ann Arbor where she rose 2 to 3 times a week. Whenever I share my life story, people always say how horrible it was. I tell them, honestly, looking back, it was the best thing that ever happened to us. We were never the couple who held hands, kissed, displayed affection for each other in public. What happened to us strengthened our faith, and it strengthened our relationship with each other. Jesus doesn't always make his reasons known to the person at the time it's happening. Not right away, sometimes not in our lifetime, but he has a plan for each of us. Our motto is, now, God makes everything happen for a reason. We get behind a slow car, we don't get mad. We say, Jesus is looking out for us. If we were going faster, we might get into an accident up the road. When things don't go our way, we try and put our faith in Jesus. Where one door closes, he opens another one. We are very blessed. Things could have gone very differently, but Alesha listened to God when he spoke to her on that mountain and told her that something was coming that she needed to make both her physical and spiritual life right for. We may not always like to listen to him, but we just need to put our trust and faith in him. Jesus used all that happened, both the good and the bad, to strengthen our family's faith in him. I'd like you to meet my wife, Alesha, and thank you for allowing me to share our story and be a part of our miracle. May God bless you and produce miracles in your life as well.